So teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. Do you number your days?
And if there is anything that has more of my heart, more of my passion, more of my affections, it is glorified above him.
The more you love God, the more you hate those things that dishonor him.
All these little choices of the bad rather than the good, they are steps on the path to hell.
Hello, and welcome to How to Walk Like a Giant. I'm Jonathan, and today for our second episode, I wanted to talk about Hudson Taylor. Hudson Taylor is considered one of the most influential figures in Christian missions. He really revolutionized how missionaries should share the gospel in foreign countries, especially where cultures are so different than their own. His life is well documented across multiple biographies. I read the one by Gregg Lewis called Hudson Taylor's Spiritual Secret, and was just floored by his example of putting his faith into action. So here's the plan. I'm going to give a brief overview of his life, highlight those key moments, and along the way share my key takeaways I had from my notes and studying up on them. So sit back, listen up, and let's dive in. The one thing which really stood out about Hudson Taylor for me was just seeing how far he was willing to go for the sake of the gospel. Forget about all the challenges he faced while on the mission field. Even just getting there took 6 months by boat, and the boats at the time weren't the ones that we have today. We're not talking about cruise liners or anything like that. They were old and wooden, and long sea voyages often ended in shipwrecks, with most of the crew and passengers missing. But still, that wasn't enough to keep Hudson Taylor from going. I'll get into more details later, but as we walk through his life, just keep that in the back of your mind. The fact that Hudson Taylor had this profound willingness to sacrifice for the sake of the gospel. Hudson Taylor was born in the small town of Barnsley, England on May 21st, 1832. Today, that's about a 3.5-hour drive north of London, really close to Manchester. He grew up in a modest, devout Christian family. His parents, James and Amelia Taylor, were known for their strong faith and their commitment to raising their children in the Christian tradition. His mother, Amelia, was particularly passionate about her faith and would often pray for her children, especially for Hudson, whom she felt God had a specific plan for. Hudson's father, James Taylor, was a pharmacist and ran his own business. This put the family in a respectable but modest economic position. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable enough. They faced the typical financial challenges common to working-class families in the 19th century England. However, unlike a lot of other families, the Taylors placed more importance on faith and living a life of integrity than acquiring wealth or status. Hudson's father had a particularly keen interest in missions and often shared stories about the spiritual needs of people in distant lands. He spoke particularly about China, expressing a longing to see the gospel spread to those who had never heard it, and this had a great influence on Hudson Taylor. Hudson was one of several children. He had one sister, Amelia, named after his mom, who was particularly close to him. His teenage years were marked by spiritual struggle. Even though he was raised in a Christian household, Hudson really struggled to make Christianity his own. During these years, he drifted away from the Christian beliefs he was taught, really questioning the strict teachings of his family, and explored a more secular lifestyle. By his early teens, he began rejecting the faith and values he had grown up with. Despite his doubts, Hudson's parents remained steadfast in their prayers for him, especially his mother, who continually prayed that her son would encounter Christ in a meaningful way. At the age of 15, Hudson finished school and began working in a local bank. The banking job exposed him to a new social circle where he encountered people who held different beliefs and values from those he'd grown up with. The new environment pulled him further away from the Christian principles his family had instilled in him. However, the rigorous demands of his job and the pressures of this lifestyle really began to take a toll on his health, and he eventually returned home to recover. Over the next few years at home, he continued to grapple with feelings of spiritual emptiness and doubt. However, at the age of 17, he finally converted to Christianity, and this is how it happened. One day while Hudson Taylor was at home, he wandered into his father's library, and he picked up a gospel tract called "It Is Finished." As Hudson was listening to this tract, Christ's work on the cross finally struck him deeply. The tract was referring to John 19 verse 30, which were the last words Jesus spoke. The passage signifies that Jesus had accomplished the purpose for which he came, to provide salvation and humanity through his death. And this was the moment of Hudson's conversion, and he later wrote that, quote, "If Christ has done all this for me, what ought I not do for him?" End quote. It just so happens that his mom, who was away on a trip at that time, randomly felt a really strong urge to pray for her son's salvation. So she did, and when she returned home and heard of Hudson's conversion, she was overcome with joy, really seeing it as an answer to her prayers. Reading up to this point in Hudson's life, I was thinking about the perspective of his parents. Obviously, they did everything in their power to set the example for Hudson by raising him in a Christian home and encouraged him to adopt the faith. But sometimes things don't go the way that you hope. I can just imagine their frustration and anger and ultimately patience they had to show towards Hudson as he's actively rejecting Christianity. The one thing which they could do was pray, and it seems like Hudson's mother really took on that role. I think it's also a recognition that our faith has to be our own. The decision to become a Christian isn't something that you can force on someone else. It's a very personal decision, and one that usually requires a bit of back and forth to really contemplate the severity of your own personal sin. Now, this isn't going to look the same for everyone. Everyone is going to have their own process to get there, but all it takes is one moment, one good word, or one piece of advice from someone else. And I think we can get a lot of confidence from that. God works in a variety of ways, and for Hudson Taylor, it was just a matter of picking up an old gospel tract which clicked everything for him. And so this was just a key takeaway I had from his conversion story, and it really encouraged me to think about how I might be sharing the gospel with others. Continuing on with Hudson Taylor's life, after his conversion, it really changed him. His life took a whole new focus. He became passionate about studying the Bible, spending hours in prayer, and seeking God's guidance. He soon felt a calling to missionary work in China, a place which he had heard so much about from his father. His newfound faith led him to a more disciplined lifestyle, marked by simplicity and a growing reliance on God. In preparation for mission work, Hudson began training in various practical skills, including medicine as a medical assistant, which he believed would be useful in reaching and helping people on the mission field. Fast forwarding a bit, at the age of 21, Hudson Taylor embarked on his first journey to China. He boarded a merchant ship named the Dumfries in Liverpool, England, which was bound for Shanghai, China. The trip itself was very difficult. The realities of 19th century sea travel meant that this journey was very unpredictable and uncomfortable, especially for someone like Hudson who had never before left England. The journey lasted nearly 6 months, during which Hudson Taylor faced rough seas, stormy weather, and long stretches of isolation. The conditions on the ship were primitive. Passengers often slept in cramped quarters with poor ventilation, and fresh food was a luxury that quickly dwindled after departure. The constant rocking of the ship made for difficult living conditions, often accompanied by seasickness. Hudson Taylor, like many passengers, was forced to adapt to the lack of comforts and learn to manage his daily routine under these harsh conditions. There were many instances where the Dumfries encountered severe storms. The ship would be tossed about in these violent waves, and passengers would be fearing for their lives. Hudson Taylor recorded his fears and prayed during these times, trusting that God had called him to China and would protect him. In his journal, he wrote, quote, "I felt that the same faithful love which had called me from my native land could prove itself faithful to the uttermost," end quote. Isolated from the comforts and distractions of home, Hudson Taylor spent many hours reading the Bible and praying, deepening his relationship with God. Hudson Taylor used this time to study Chinese, knowing that language would be essential for effective ministry. I mentioned this at the start of the episode. I was just so amazed at Hudson Taylor's willingness to get on this journey to China. And as I read this part of his biography, I couldn't help but think about the conviction he must have had to share the gospel with the Chinese people. He likely never saw a Chinese person before, he definitely never left England, and he had never lived on a ship for an extended period of time. And yet he was still willing to go. It was going to be a tough, long 6 months, and yet he embraced it. This whole saga of him on the ship was just mind-boggling to me, and it made me wonder what God might be asking me to commit to, which I really don't want to. Okay, fast forwarding a bit to when Hudson Taylor arrived in Shanghai. It was the year 1854, and he stepped out into a vibrant, bustling city that was a stark contrast to his quiet life in England. After 6 long months at sea, Shanghai was a sensory whirlwind, a mix of sounds, sights, and smells that made him acutely aware that he was definitely in a new world. The city was alive with the activity of merchants, boats were crowded in the harbors, and people were speaking in languages he could only partially understand. At that time, Shanghai was also politically unstable, with foreign imperialist influence increasing tensions between the local Chinese residents and Westerners. The city was divided into different sections where European and American communities lived and operated with separate laws from those that governed the Chinese. The segregation and visible tension created a deep divide of misunderstanding and mistrust between the East and the West, and this divide troubled Hudson Taylor as he wanted to bring the gospel in a way that showed love and respect rather than dominance or control. As a result, one of Hudson Taylor's first major decisions was to fully immerse himself in the culture. This was a decision that would define his approach to missions. When he had first started to evangelize to locals, he found that Chinese people were hesitant to engage with foreigners. Hudson Taylor felt something needed to change, and so he soon started wearing Chinese clothing, shaved his head in the traditional Chinese style, and learned to speak Mandarin. He realized that if he were to reach the Chinese people, he would need to adapt his way of life to connect with them. This choice was shocking among other Western missionaries who kept their Western attire. However, Hudson Taylor felt strongly that to share the gospel, he needed to remove barriers and demonstrate respect for Chinese customs and traditions. Reflecting on his decision, Taylor said, quote, "Let us in everything not sinful become Chinese, that by all means we may save some," end quote. Getting acquainted with Shanghai was difficult. Hudson Taylor faced logistical challenges, including finding a place to stay and securing food and resources, often relying on his limited funds. Living in Shanghai was costly and money was tight. There were many instances where he'd skip a meal or receive funds just in time to pay the monthly rent. Hudson Taylor also faced health issues soon after arriving. The hot, humid climate was exhausting, and he struggled with the physical toll it took on him. Illnesses common in China were new to him, and medical resources were limited. I am just so amazed at how he remained undeterred, viewing every hardship as part of his calling. During his time in China, Hudson Taylor met his future wife, Maria Dyer, in 1857, so this was 3 years after he arrived. Maria was the daughter of missionaries to Malaysia, and she was born in Penang, Malaysia in 1837. She was raised in a deeply Christian environment, and after the early death of her parents, she was sent to a missionary school in England. At the age of 17, she traveled to Ningbo, China, where she was a teacher and missionary herself, working to spread the gospel and educate Christian women. Maria's commitment to mission work, her deep faith, and her understanding of Chinese culture impressed Hudson Taylor. The two quickly became close, and they got married on January 20th, 1858. As Hudson Taylor worked in China, he began to see the limitations of existing mission strategies. Most missionaries stayed in the coastal cities where Westerners were more accepted. But Hudson Taylor felt that God was calling him to reach the unreached people living in China's interior. He had a vision of bringing the gospel to every province, not just the ones along the coast. Driven by this conviction, he decided to found the China Inland Mission, CIM, in 1865. The China Inland Mission was unique for several reasons. Unlike other missionary organizations, CIM did not require formal pledges of financial support. Hudson Taylor believed that if God called someone to go to China, God would also provide for their needs. This approach required immense faith and often led to financial uncertainty, but Hudson Taylor held firm to this belief that God would supply. He famously said, quote, "God's work done in God's way will never lack God's supply," end quote. Hudson Taylor's approach also included recruiting missionaries who were willing to adopt Chinese customs, learn the language, and live simply. CIM quickly gained momentum, attracting missionaries who were drawn to Hudson Taylor's radical vision. Despite the hardships, CIM grew, and Hudson Taylor's faith in God's provision inspired many. His philosophy of relying solely on prayer and faith rather than traditional fundraising has since influenced countless missionary organizations. CIM still stands today, and it is known as OMF, overseas missionary fellowship. Hudson Taylor's life in China was still extremely challenging. He faced sickness, threats, isolation, and frequent financial strain. He also endured profound personal losses. In 1870, Taylor's wife Maria and several of their young children died from cholera. These losses were devastating, and Hudson Taylor grieved deeply. Yet he continued to lean on his faith, saying, quote, "God uses men who are weak and feeble enough to lean on him," end quote. He would later remarry to Jenny Fodling, a fellow missionary with the China Inland Mission, whom he had known for several years before Maria's death. Reading about Hudson Taylor's time in China made me feel like I'm really doing nothing with my own life. Here he is on the field, creating his own missions organization at the age of 33 and preaching to the Chinese people. He sees dramatic success, but along the way, he is faced with very difficult challenges. I can only imagine how the death of his family must have been. He would have been 38 years old at that time. And yet, he lifts it all up to the Lord and decides to continue his missionary work in China. His testament of faith was just so profound. I get the sense that if this happened in today's day and age, many would just pack up and leave for their home country. It was just really inspiring to read about this section of Hudson Taylor's life and made me question what I'm doing with mine. Anyways, fast forwarding to the 1890s, China faced growing tensions with Western nations, which led to anti-foreign sentiments. Many Chinese resented the presence of Westerners, including missionaries. Hudson Taylor's heart was broken by the hostility, but he understood why the Chinese people felt that way. Finally, in 1900, the Boxer Rebellion occurred, which was an anti-foreign uprising. The violence spread quickly, and many missionaries were targeted. Over 58 CIM missionaries and 21 children were killed. Hudson Taylor was absolutely devastated by the news. He struggled to understand why God would allow such a tragedy to happen. In one letter, he wrote, quote, "I cannot read, I cannot think, I cannot even pray, but I can trust," end quote. Despite the loss, Hudson Taylor continued to trust that God's purposes would prevail. He was too ill to remain in China. He was about 68 at this point, and so he returned to England, leaving the mission he had founded in the hands of others. The Boxer Rebellion marked a dark period for CIM, but the organization still survived. Hudson Taylor spent his final years in England, where he continued to advocate for missions in China. Though he couldn't travel, he prayed for the country daily and kept in close contact with CIM leaders. Hudson Taylor died on June 3, 1905, after spending more than 50 years devoted to China. His life was marked by radical faith, immense sacrifice, and a deep love for the Chinese people. Reflecting on his story, it's really Hudson Taylor's radical dependence, which I really admire. This was one of his most defining characteristics, this ability to have an unwavering trust in God to provide for all of his needs. His quote where he says, "God's work done in God's way will never lack God's supply," is something that I've really been reflecting on. He refused to solicit funds directly and instead relied on prayer, believing that if God truly wanted him to accomplish something, God would also provide for it. This was just such a good reminder for me. In today's world, there's so much that emphasizes self-sufficiency and financial security. Hudson Taylor's example encourages us to trust God for our needs, to step out in faith, and to live with open hands. It doesn't mean we avoid practical planning, but rather it's more about being super intentional about acknowledging God as our ultimate source and surrendering our concerns about provision to Him. And so there we have it. That's Hudson Taylor and his story about how he became a Christian giant. I hope this episode encouraged you and helped you reflect on your own life. Don't forget to follow this podcast if you haven't already and share it with others. I'll see you in the next one. Go in peace.
So teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. Do you number your days?
And if there is anything that has more of my heart, more of my passion, more of my affections, it is glorified above Him.
The more you love God, the more you hate those things that dishonor Him.
All these little choices of the bad rather than the good, they are steps on the path to hell.